said it?
I just came in.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. I would like to ask everybody, if you can, for those sitting on the side, to join us around the table so that at least we have quorum for our meeting today, or our side event, our panel. Thank you all for joining us today, and particularly in light of the weather yesterday and the rescheduling. We do appreciate your participation in this morning's side event regarding Palestine refugees, poverty, challenges, and prospects. I wish to welcome you all this morning and to welcome all of our distinguished panelists. I'd like to make just some opening remarks, and then we'll introduce the panelists in a little more detail as we move forward. Just to begin very briefly, to my left is the director of UNRWA office here in New York, Mr. Mathias Schmale. We also have with us Ms. Leila Hilal, an independent researcher on Middle East affairs. And again, I will give you a little bit more of their background as we proceed. Ms. Irfan, who is joining us from the International History Department of the London School of Economics, and Mr. Pietro Stefanini of the Palestinian Return Center. Ladies and gentlemen, I am the Deputy Permanent Observer of the Permanent Observer Mission of the State of Palestine to the United Nations in New York, and along with the Palestinian Return Center, we are pleased to welcome you all to today's side event, which we are holding in the context of the 55th session of the Commission for Social Development, which is focusing on strategies for the eradication of poverty to achieve sustainable development for all. We extend our sincere appreciation to the panelists and thank them for their effort, time, and participation, and thank all present here for this discussion. Distinguished colleagues, the Palestine refugees constitute nearly 25% of the world's refugee population, over 40% of the globe's long-term refugees, and constitute the most protracted refugee crisis in contemporary times. Over 5.3 million Palestine refugees are registered with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, and they are dispersed throughout the region in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and occupied Palestine, with millions of men, women, and children still living in 59 refugee camps established following the onset of their plight in the 1948 Nakba. Their plight remains painful proof that unresolved conflicts do not dissipate or disappear with the passage of time, but are rather compounded and exacerbated in the absence of just solutions. In the long years of their exile and dispossession, the continued denial of their rights, including to return to live at peace and to compensation for their losses in line with Resolution 194 of the General Assembly and the principles of international law, has forced successive generations of Palestinians to endure great hardship, deprivation, marginalization, repeated displacement, and the harsh impact of violent crises. While it has only been 4 months since the General Assembly's adoption of the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, ongoing crises compel immediate follow-up. We believe it is time to translate words into meaningful action to remedy the plight of the world's millions of refugees and migrants by providing them with humanitarian assistance to alleviate poverty and hardship and promote their human development, while at the same time, of course, exerting every possible effort to uphold their rights and to address the root causes that have forced millions of people to leave the sanctity and safety of their homes and devastated so many lives. The Palestine refugees cannot be the exception to the rights and commitments affirmed in that important declaration, and this includes the commitment to actively promote durable solutions, particularly in protracted refugee situations, with a focus on sustainable and timely return in safety and dignity, as was set forth in paragraph 75 of the Declaration. Likewise, the Palestine refugees cannot be the exception to the commitments affirmed in Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, which also focuses its goals, targets, and indicators on refugees as among the most vulnerable categories of people. especially in the first and second goals, namely no poverty and zero hunger. UNRWA has actually been promoting the Agenda 2030 ethos far before it was even developed and adopted. The agency's core mandate, focused on education, healthy and productive lives, has been instrumental for fostering development among the Palestine refugees, ensuring for them opportunities for learning and livelihood, essential for not being left behind, and nurturing self-reliance and resilient communities and societies. With the support of the international community, UNRWA has helped to alleviate the hardships of the Palestine refugees and has been a lifeline for so many of them, as we've seen as we are witness to now in the context of the disastrous conflict in Syria, with its massive spillover into Lebanon and Jordan, or in occupied Palestine, where the brutalities and indignities of the Israeli occupation and the blockade of the Gaza Strip and successive military aggressions have gravely affected the refugee community. UNRWA has also been widely recognized as a stabilizing factor in our region, protecting Palestine refugees from the impacts of ongoing conflict, from poverty, and offering them opportunities for development in spite of the difficult socioeconomic conditions that prevail. Moreover, at the same time, and as we have members of civil society here joining us and academia, I have to highlight the role of civil society organizations and other stakeholders at national and regional levels as an essential element towards addressing the plight of our refugees and towards contributing in the present to strengthening the mechanisms aimed at fulfilling both the pledges of Agenda 2030 and the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants. We stress the importance of exploring ways to create more opportunities for meaningful communication that engages governments, parliaments, civil society, and all other relevant stakeholders in the implementation process for addressing the needs of the most vulnerable who, until now, have been left behind. I wish to begin our panel today with a presentation from UNRWA focused on the challenges facing Palestine refugees as they strive to live dignified and productive lives in spite of their plight, with special focus on Palestine refugees in Lebanon and Syria. I welcome Mr. Mathias Schmale, who has just assumed his responsibilities as Director for UNRWA's Representative Office in New York. Prior to joining UNRWA, Mr. Schmale held posts of Undersecretary General with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, as International Director with the British Red Cross, and Secretariat Director with International Save the Children Alliance. In earlier years, he worked in several senior positions with the IFRC in Geneva, with its country program in Sudan, and its regional office in Nairobi, covering 14 countries. Mr. Schmale's last post before coming to New York as UNRWA Director was as UNRWA Director in Lebanon from April 2015 to September 2016. And for Syria from September to December 2016. I give the floor to you, Mr. Schmale.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon by now. Thank you to the Permanent Observer Mission of the State of Palestine and the Palestine Return Center for this kind invitation and the opportunity to share with you an UNRWA perspective on the poverty and challenges faced by Palestine refugees across our 5 fields of operation, as we call it. The scale and severity of the conflict in the Middle East region has inflicted, as I think all of you know, and this has just been alluded to already, on the Palestine refugee community, arguably the most profound protection and human development crisis since the original displacement at the end of the 1940s. Levels of food insecurity and poverty are high and increasing, and in particular rates of youth unemployment, especially affecting female youth, are alarming. We have found that poverty rates and unemployment are particularly acute in a number of what is called gatherings, so people living sort of illegally outside camps, and then in the 58 official Palestine refugee camps across the region. The vulnerability of different groups, including women, children, and persons with disability, their vulnerability to violence and abuse is increasing. Prolonged political, social, and economic instability combined with repeated and widespread violations of human rights, will have significant adverse effects also on the mental health and psychosocial well-being of Palestine refugees. This is not just about material poverty. Disaggregation of key indicators, for instance, by gender, reveals that literacy rates among female refugees continue to lag behind those of male refugees across all 5 fields of our operations. Refugee women also experience significantly lower levels of employment and higher levels of unemployment in most fields where we work. I've already mentioned that refugees living inside camps are generally more vulnerable than those living outside of camps, with substantial variations in health, education, livelihood opportunities, poverty rates, and living conditions. A couple of projections include that the number of poor among the refugees, Palestine refugees, is expected to increase from 1.63 million in 2012 to over 2 million in 2021, of whom more than 500,000 will be what we call abject poor, so not able to even meet their basic food needs. What's also significant is that during the period now from last year, 2016 to 2021, approximately 580,000 Palestine refugee children will become adults. And from our point of view, unless action is taken to improve their chances in life, over 90% of these now children and soon to be adults will complete basic education, but many will then not find gainful employment. Around 60% of this group have lived through at least one conflict, and over 1/3 will be a member of a family living in poverty. A small number of girls, around 7,000 in the projections we have, will have had their first child before turning 18. It would be wrong not to mention that a number of health and education-related indicators for Palestine refugees reflect some significant achievements in human development over time. And it's not just UNRWA's work, it's civil society that you have mentioned, Palestinian Authority, etc. So we should not lose sight that there have been some achievements, and the point is we need to preserve that. Life expectancy at birth, for example, an indication of the overall mortality level of a population, is similar to host populations and higher than average expectancies among both men and women in the Arab world. Overall achievements among the Palestine refugees in areas are far less positive and reflect what I've talked about in terms of the ongoing and in some cases increasing deprivation. So allow me to make a few specific remarks for each of our 5 fields of operation in this regard. In Lebanon in 2015 we carried out, or the American University in Beirut carried out a survey which confirmed that 2/3 of the Palestine refugee population living in Lebanon are in poverty, so below the official standard indicator of poverty for that country. 5 years on from an initial survey, that has not changed. So there's been no progress in terms of overcoming poverty over a period of 5 years. In December last year, 2016, there were, in addition to the some 270,000, 280,000 Palestine refugees from Lebanon, just over 32,000 Palestine refugees from Syria living in Lebanon. And the survey that I mentioned revealed that their unemployment rate reaches a staggering 52.5%, more than double of the rate for Palestine refugees from Lebanon. The survey also noted that nearly 90% of the PRS, the Palestine refugees from Syria, continue to live in poverty. 95% of them are food insecure, and 9% live in extreme poverty, so again unable to meet their most essential food requirements. West Bank and Gaza, as we approach 2017 and 50 years of Israeli occupation, the situation of Palestine refugees in the occupied Palestinian territories is as critical as it's ever been. A recent study, 2014, in the occupied Palestinian territory found insecurity levels of 57% in Gaza and 19% in the West Bank, primarily due to the effects of blockade and occupation. These indicator statistics represent a reversal of improvements in the West Bank and Gaza between 2009 and 2011. So there were improvements then when the overall food security actually fell. Since then, it's back up. In Gaza, UNRWA will seek to provide food assistance in 2017 to a staggering more than 900,000 people, more than a tenfold increase on the 80,000 refugees that received this type of assistance from us at the start of 2000. I don't probably need to tell you the socio-economic context in Gaza has further deteriorated last year. Unemployment, for example, increased for the third consecutive quarter in 2016 and reached 43% in quarter 3 of 2016. You also all know that some 140,000 refugee homes were affected during the 2014 conflict. Of those, only 71,000 homes have been somewhat repaired and 12,000 underway, so that leaves 57,000 homes yet to be repaired. And you can imagine what that means in socio-economic terms of the families. There are more than 6,700 families that remain displaced with uninhabitable shelters. Loss of livelihoods in the Gaza still has eroded the coping strategies on already vulnerable refugee community and led to rising food insecurity, which is estimated in Gaza to be at 47, so almost half of the population is food insecure. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, violence, military operations by Israeli food security forces, access restrictions, forced displacements in the context of a very restrictive discriminatory planning regime have increased also significantly since October 2015. High food insecurity and unemployment levels within refugee communities are the main drivers of need here. And this is again particularly true in refugee camps where food insecurity levels in the West Bank reach 29% of the refugee households. Jordan is host to some 2 million Palestine refugees and has been a generous host historically, as I think again many of you will know. However, over 13% of the refugees residing outside of the camps in Jordan do live below the national poverty line. So we should also, with all the attention on the occupied territories in Syria, lose sight of that. You have mentioned already the horrors of war and displacement in Syria. Of the 560,000 Palestine refugees registered with us there, around 400,000 have been forced from their original homes in Syria, with as many as 120,000 fleeing the country to surrounding countries and beyond, including Europe. We expect this year that we will remain the main provider of humanitarian assistance, so not even talking about addressing poverty and development. We will have to continue basic humanitarian assistance to 430,000 Palestine refugees affected by the conflict there. In conclusion then, the catastrophic conflict in Syria, as I've just mentioned, has resulted in significant displacement of more than half of the 560,000 registered refugees there. The occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continues to have a devastating impact on poverty levels. We estimate that Gaza will be unlivable in less than 3 years unless urgent remedial action is taken this year. The situation for Palestine refugees in Lebanon is exacerbated by lack of rights and socio-economic inclusion, very limited employment opportunity. In Jordan, I've mentioned Palestine refugees facing hardships, including thousands living in substandard shelters and in abject poverty. It is concerning for us in UNRWA to note that the gains we have collectively again made in supporting human development in the past have been significantly undermined by the various conflicts I've mentioned. And so from a humanitarian perspective, not a political perspective, we do need robust political action to address these conflicts and to keep hopes for a just solution for Palestine refugees alive. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Schmale, for this important intervention that I think has highlighted the depth of the humanitarian crisis and insecurities being endured by the Palestine refugees at this time. I'm struck in particular by the assessment, which we fully share, that currently Palestine refugees are facing the most profound crisis since the onset of their plight in 1948. In terms of their vulnerability, in terms of the poverty and marginalization, in terms of the fragmentation of the community, and the impact of the crises and conflict in the region on their very subsistence and ability to cope and to remain resilient. We also recognize fully the significant humanitarian and human development work being done by UNRWA day in, day out, and continuously appealing for cooperation and support to the agency in fulfilling its mandate on behalf of the Palestinian refugees. Thank you again. I now wish to welcome Mr. Pietro Stefanini, who is researcher and advocacy coordinator at the Palestinian Return Center based in London. He will brief us today on the socioeconomic challenges facing the Palestinian refugees in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Mr. Stefanini coordinates the PRC's parliamentary activities in the United Kingdom and its advocacy at the UN in Geneva and New York. In 2016, he authored 2 reports, one entitled Forgotten People, Assessing Poverty Among Palestine Refugees in Lebanon, and another one entitled Home Demolitions, the Destruction of Palestinian Living Space. The past year, he's presented his research findings and given talks at the European Parliament, at the UK Parliament, and at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. He is also co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Refugee Studies. Mr. Stefanini, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Permanent Observer Mission of Palestine for supporting this event. So I want to try and provide a brief overview of the situation that Palestine refugees face in the occupied Palestinian territories from a socio-economic perspective. First, I will try to make a few general points about the Palestinian economy. Then I will try to give a snapshot of the challenges refugees face in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. According to the Special Rapporteur to the Human Rights Council, Mr. Michael Link, Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, the Palestinian economy is without parallel in the modern world. And one of the main reasons for this is the Palestinian territorial components. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, are separated physically from each other. And in the past 2 decades, the Palestinian economy has experienced sort of economic growth that it has been judged to be unsustainable because of mainly 2 reasons. The first one, it's been highly dependent upon foreign aid and private consumption of imports. And the second reason is that the Israeli occupation has increasingly separated and shrunk the different regions of Palestinian territory, creating a dysfunctional economic base and deprived the capacity for a real autonomous development. And so trying to build a sovereign economy under a prolonged occupation that is entering its 50th year is just simply a contradiction, impossible to reconcile. They are, if you may, 2 mutually exclusive concepts. Now, I'm going to make a few points about the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In Gaza, there's almost a population of 2 million people, which over 1 million are Palestinian refugees. And it is estimated that over 500,000 are living in the 8 recognized refugee camps. The blockade, the current blockade enforced by the occupying power and Egypt, fully implemented since 2007, has been described as a collective penalty against the population of Gaza. And this blockade has had a devastating impact on Palestinian refugees, including those living in camps. And as mentioned already, the unemployment rate remains among the highest in the world. And yes, you've heard already that the Palestinian refugees at the moment require almost 1 million Palestinian refugees require food assistance. But I think it's important to say that this is not a natural disaster that we could have not prevented. The growing dependence on aid and foreign funding, which undermines the potential basis of a homegrown development of the Gaza Strip, has been described as actually de-development. And Harvard professor Sarah Roy argues that de-development is the process, and I quote, of deliberate and systematic and increasing dismemberment by a dominant economy of an indigenous economy, whose economic and therefore social potential are not just damaged, but they are actually negated. So she argues that over the past decade, Israel has been enforcing a policy of maintaining Gaza at a level of essential humanitarian requirements and little more. And so it is this intentional denial of the access to the means of production that can be considered a form of collective punishment. But this situation is not a recent development, as already has been mentioned. In 2012, a major UN study questioned whether Gaza would be a sustainable place to live by 2020. Moving on to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, there are almost 3 million total Palestinians living in these areas, and approximately over 800,000 are registered refugees. And of those 800,000, there are around 238,000 living in 19 camps registered with UNRWA. And here the latest UNRWA figures estimate unemployment rate at almost 20% in the refugee camps. And one of the main concerns I'd like to highlight about the refugee camps in the West Bank is that they are severely overcrowded. Out of 19 refugee camps, 5 are suffering from overcrowding. And just to make a general point, the economy of the West Bank is not at the catastrophic level of Gaza's, but nor it is flourishing. And between 1999 and 2014, the economy only grew by 14% in real terms, and in large part because of the fragmentation of the territory that I mentioned earlier under this prolonged occupation. So the situation in the West Bank for Palestinian refugees is increasingly precarious, and they continue to experience difficult socioeconomic conditions rooted in occupation-related policies, and the recent rise of house demolitions and the continued access and movement restrictions. And as mentioned already, the food insecurity is particularly affecting them. Now, the restrictions that the occupying power impose in order to facilitate the settlement expansion has severe economic repercussions for Palestinians. The World Bank estimates that if Israel lifted administrative restrictions such as on construction and resource extraction, it could generate over $3.4 billion annually for the Palestinian economy. And so despite clear prohibitions in international humanitarian law against the exploitation by the occupying power, Israel has been exploiting natural resources in certain areas of the West Bank, including the Dead Sea minerals and water, for example. To conclude my presentation, I'd like to just highlight that for the reasons I mentioned, the delivery of basic services in Gaza and the West Bank can only be expected to become more pressing in 2017. And although humanitarian assistance is critical, no matter how robust this is, it cannot be a solution to ending the Israeli occupation, which it is the root cause of the poverty levels that Palestinian refugees continue to face today.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanini, for your comprehensive presentation, clearly presenting some many important facts, raising awareness of the realities of the hardships being faced by the Palestinian refugees in occupied Palestine, but beyond that, touching on the root causes and highlighting the challenges they face and the importance of fostering that resilience, not just through humanitarian aid, but through advocacy and promotion of their rights under the current circumstances, and in that sense highlighting something that we have also been repeatedly stating, that humanitarian aid and action alone cannot be the remedy, that in parallel to alleviating the hardships that people are enduring in real time, human lives, that we have to work on finding sustainable political solutions that are just and viable. And I thank you again for that. Our third speaker today is Ms. Irfan, who is currently a PhD candidate in the International History Department at the London School of Economics. Her doctoral research examines the historical development of the Palestinian national movement in the refugee camps. She has a BA in Modern History from Oxford University and dual masters from the London School of Economics and Columbia University. In March 2016, she was invited to speak in the UK Parliament on the plight of Palestine refugees from Syria. Ms. Erfan, you have the floor.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for attending today, and to the mission and the PSC for inviting me. I believe we're going to have a short video after this about education.
Yeah.
Inshallah. Okay. So in this short time that I have, I'd like to, I guess, slightly introduce a sort of short overview to the subject of education, which we'll see more about in the video, and look at how education can work, how it has worked as a strategy for tackling and even eradicating poverty levels among refugees, particularly those refugees in the camps who, as we've heard, are usually among the worst off of the community, not always, but usually. And of course, this subject has a particular relevance given the current political situation and the ongoing worldwide refugee crisis. And the Palestinians, we have a protracted situation from whom we can hopefully learn some lessons going forwards. Now, when it comes to education, we're all aware that it has the potential to be the most transformative of all humanitarian or all welfare services. This is why I've really chosen to highlight it today. It's education that has the potential to reduce poverty in the long term across generations when it's done right. The UN itself has acknowledged this through Sustainable Development Goal 4. So SDG Goal 4 focuses on education, and it in fact describes it as the foundation for sustainable development. This potential, the potential for engendering change in the long term, makes education particularly relevant when we are discussing a protracted refugee crisis, such as that of the Palestinians. As we are all too unfortunately aware, the Palestinian refugees are into their 69th year of dispossession. There is no sign of pending resolution to their plight anytime soon, so they are an appropriate case for us to consider more long-term strategies for tackling poverty. Moreover, as we'll see in the video, the Palestinian refugees themselves have consistently and very strongly contended that in their eyes, education is key. The refugees have demanded access to schooling as a fundamental right from almost the very beginning of their exile, and they continue to insist on it today. So this fixation, this prioritization of education has really been a constant feature of Palestinian refugee life. And I mention this to make the point that it's considered important not only at the international level, not only by the UN, but also by the Palestinian refugees themselves, whose own opinions we obviously need to always put at the center of our consideration. In education, we have really a perfect case of their priorities and the UN's priorities. And what's more, this has been the case from very early on. So, as we're all aware, the Palestinian refugee crisis began with the Nakba in 1948. It saw huge numbers fleeing across the Middle East, and as is usually the case in such situations, the poorest of them ended up in the refugee camps. Now, as we heard from Pietro and from Mr. Schmale, the conditions in these camps are often below par, far removed from what would be desirable. But in the early days of exile, this was even more the case. So the late 1940s and the early 50s saw the camps really characterized by severe overcrowding, malnutrition, poor sanitation, very high levels of sickness. None of us would be particularly surprised to hear that. What is surprising is that even in these conditions, even as early as 1949, the refugees were demanding access to education, despite the fact that from perhaps an external standpoint, there might appear to have been more immediate problems. Now, I am not saying that the refugees were not concerned about malnutrition or sanitation or any of the other issues I just mentioned. They very much were. But what's important is that they did not overlook education in the demands they were making at this time to the UN, which was newly created, to the various international aid agencies which were providing services in the camps, and to the local governing authorities. We actually have records of these demands and this concern with education, both in the testimonies of refugees themselves and in the records of the various organizations and authorities. So this was significant enough and it was widespread enough to be noted on all sides. What's more, we know that the Palestinian refugees did not only demand education, they were not simply recipients of it, they were actually the first to provide it in the camps. So it was individual refugees who set up the very first makeshift classes, the first open-air lessons in 1949, very beginning of exile. It was usually individuals who had been teachers in Palestine before 1948 and who were determined that the next generation were not going to lose their education despite having lost their homes. So they were not only demanding it, they were actually making it happen from very early on. It was really the clearest sign of how vital they held education to be. We have the Georgetown emphasis at this point. So education has been key from early on. Now, why is this? The reasons for this fixation on education really get to the heart of our subject today. So why have the Palestinian refugees so consistently and fervently demanded schooling for their children? It's because they've really seen it as the key to their futures, as the key to improving the next generation's prospects and opportunities, and most essentially as the way to prevent their children from remaining or ending up in the same state of poverty in the camps. So education in their eyes is the key to many of the forms of progress that we heard about from the first speaker. And this is not simply a historical point, it's one of continuing relevance. So even today, the Palestinian refugees really prioritize education, again as we'll see in the video. Any even suggestion or rumor that schooling in the camps might be cut or might be taken away is always met by very fervent protests. Now, to give a bit more information on how education actually works in the camp schools themselves are administered by UNRWA across its 5 fields in the Levant. UNRWA provides free, comprehensive education to all registered Palestinian refugee children. It has done ever since it began its operations in 1950. It continues to do so today. This education program, the provision of free, comprehensive education, I would argue has probably been the most significant of all services provided in the Palestinian camps. Education has had the most transformative impact on life in the camps and on long-term trends. As has been indicated by certain variables, so as we heard, there's very high literacy rates among Palestinian refugees. This actually became the case pretty early on. Literacy rates skyrocketed, essentially within a generation of UNRWA bringing in free education. The UNRWA program also had an impact on gender equity because education was free. So families could send all their children to school. They didn't have to split up and just send one, who might usually have been a boy. And again, we have the lasting impact of this in the high rates of female literacy among Palestinian refugees compared to many equivalent socioeconomic groups. Although, again, as we heard, they are still, unfortunately, slightly less than male literacy rates. Most importantly for our purposes today, the introduction of education meant that Palestinian refugees over time gained key assets in the job market. So the high quality of the UNRWA schools, the fact that they were internationally organized and internationally administered, meant that the Palestinian refugees gained a reputation as being highly educated. They were actually called, or they have been called, the best educated refugees in the world. And as graduates of the UNRWA education system, the Palestinian refugees have gained a new desirability as employees in the Middle East. In fact, if we go back a couple of decades, the Palestinian refugees were some of the major beneficiaries of the new jobs that were created in the Gulf following the oil boom. So quite significant numbers of young Palestinian men from the 70s onwards left their camps in the Levant and went to work in the Gulf. This had a kind of knock-on effect in terms of reducing poverty. Their relocation obviously removed some people from the camps and removed strain in that sense. But also, the vast majority of these men would then send remissions back home to their families who were still in the camps. So this helped provide support and helped tackle poverty in a more structural way in the long term too. In this way, the impact of education was one factor that has contributed to falling poverty levels in very broad terms. It's contributed to things such as a reduction in the number of families claiming rations, increased employment, and perhaps most interestingly, a more common trend for refugees to take professional work rather than unskilled work. Essentially, it could be argued that in the Palestinian refugees, we have a case study of the positive long-term impact education can have in tackling poverty. However, this is of course not to suggest that education is any kind of panacea. It can only go so far in improving socioeconomic conditions and in tackling poverty in a situation where politics dominates everything, as we've heard. So while education has contributed to reducing poverty in the camps, while it has huge value, the wider context has still placed very significant limitations on exactly how much of an impact it can really have. I won't go into too much detail on this because the previous two speakers have done an excellent job of covering it, but as we've heard, things like, of course, the continuing occupation of the West Bank, the blockade of Gaza since 2007 ensure that high rates of poverty and unemployment continue in spite of very high levels of educational attainment. In Lebanon, there is legalized discrimination against Palestinian refugees that blocks them from numerous professions. So the potential that their education should bring them on the job market cannot always be realized. And since 2011, probably the worst of Palestinian refugees in some ways have been those in Syria. So these structural problems have ensured a much bigger scale for them, again, despite the fact that their educational attainment is in many ways relatively high. Finally, UNRWA itself has faced serious financial difficulties in recent years, which has compelled it to make cuts in its services. It still provides free comprehensive education, but it's been forced to introduce measures such as double shifting in schools, which has also disadvantaged the refugees. Now, I'm saying this not because I'm trying to suggest that education is ultimately futile, because of course it isn't, but I do want to place it in the political context so that we can discuss how to best make use of its potential. Two key points. So firstly, even in situations where politics dominates, education is still vital for changing what can be changed. And this is really crucial. We need to make sure we change what can be changed in the meantime. And secondly, as an investment in the potential of future generations, education is never going to be a wasted service. We need to keep this in mind. So there's much more to say on this, but in the interest of time, I will wrap up and hopefully we can speak more in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Irfan, for your presentation, which I believe has enhanced our understanding of the centrality, if not singularity, of course, of education for addressing the poverty and challenges being faced by Palestine refugees, and education's role as perhaps the most transformative forms of humanitarian aid in the lives of refugees, generation after generation. And I believe the video that will be shown now will reaffirm that from the view of Palestine refugees themselves, as rightly highlighted by Ms. Irfan, that their views and experiences must be central to shaping the support that is extended to them and the substance of the humanitarian interventions, and clearly education is key in that regard. Video.
عبد الحميد زاهد الحسن مواليد 1950 من قبل الرجل من قبلها جينا على سوريا نزعنا بالتمرين على النار أو خير النار فأنت ما طلع إمكانيات معلومين فالمنظمة أدخلتنا في المدارس علمتنا وأنا بنفس الوقت جيت علمت أولادي بالمنظمة أيضا.
أفضل بينهم مسهلين بدهم تعليم وبدهم أشياء كثير الحمد لله ودرسوا الأولاد وتعلموا ووصلوا الحمد لله لمرحلة منيحة وشقوا طريقهم للحياة.
يعني نحن مثلا مساكين في مساحة 16 سنة برغم الأمور هاي كلها تغلبنا على الصعوبات نتيجة الإصرار الأسري إنه هاي الأولاد بدها تتعلم لازم تتعلم.
الحمد لله أولادي تعلموا بالأنروا وهلا أولادي كمان عم نعلمهم بالأنروا.
يعني تعلمنا فعلا تعليمها وكان تعليمها قوي جدا حتى يعني عندنا بلغتنا جيلنا احنا كانت لغته الأجنبية جيدة جدا. إلى الآن يعني واحد يعرف إنجليزي رغم أن طريق خرجت 60 سنة. بعدين جينا رحنا على دخلنا الامتحان مخيم النيرة جينا على مخيم الموت سكننا لغاية 2012 بسبب قصرية هجرنا وجينا على المخيم جد برضه المكان متحت لنا الإجواءات قدمت لنا الخدمات.
هجرنا بال 2012 من مخيم اليرموك بعد ما كنا عايشين بأمان وأمن. لما تهجرنا وجينا هون على المراكز الإيواء توفى زوجي وعندي 3 أطفال. عانيت معاناة كبيرة بدي أكون الأم وبدي أكون الأب بنفس الوقت. كان همي الأول هم التعليم المدارس والنقط التعليمية للأولاد.
كنت بمدرسة بدرس فيها اسمها الجليل. كنت أنا ورفقاتي نلعب وندرس مع بعض. سجلنا وقعدنا مركز إيواء وقعدت بمدرسة أدرس فيها. نعتبر التعليم مهم عشان نبني مستقبل لنا لأسرتنا والحياة الكريمة. بدي أحقق أحلامي إنه أطلع معلمة اجتماعيات.
Thank you for that, and I'm sorry that the subtitles were so small. We can send a link to the video for any of the attendees interested in follow-up to the side event today. Our last panelist today is Leila Hilal. Leila is an independent expert on Middle East affairs. Her work focuses on Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, issues related to U.S. foreign policy, community-based change, constitution making, and transitional justice in the broader Middle East and North Africa. Leila also served as a senior policy advisor to the Commissioner General of UNRWA and as a legal advisor to Palestinian negotiators from 2002 until 2008. Her presentation will focus on Palestine refugee rights and solutions. So now you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you to the Permanent Observer Mission of the State of Palestine and to the Palestinian Return Center for inviting me here to speak and for organizing this event, and to all of you for coming out and participating in the discussion. I want to keep my comments limited because it would be good to get some questions and answers into the session. I wanted to speak a little bit about the limits of humanitarianism and the role of the UN in durable solutions. We've heard a lot today about how exceptional the situation of the Palestinian refugees are. Palestinian refugees constitute the longest standing refugee situation in the world. 40% of a long-lasting refugee crisis, 25% of the world's refugee population. And very dire statistics about the welfare and the levels of poverty and crises in the refugee communities. And we've also heard that Palestinian refugees are the best educated of the world's refugees. So many states of exceptionalism applies to Palestinian refugees, and this includes the situation of durable solutions and rights for the Palestinian population, despite the long-standing nature of their situation. They are the only refugee population without an international regime to promote or seek durable solutions for them. It is an anomalous situation, another one that we need to be aware of when we talk about the refugees. And I think it's an unfortunate state of exceptionalism that still stands as a major challenge for the world community and for the UN, I think, to eventually address. And just to put some defining aspects on how this political state of exceptionalism has endured for Palestinian refugees, I will remind the audience that the UNHCR, the World Refugee Agency, for the most part treats Palestinian refugees as being outside of their mandate. Under the 1951 Refugee Convention, there is what is referred to as the Exclusion Clause, which says that refugees that are receiving assistance or protection from other parts of the UN will not benefit from the convention. In the early 1950s, when there was a UN agency operating to look at the issue of solutions of repatriation and compensation for the refugees, it was decided that UNRWA would be in charge of the material aspects of Palestinian refugees, addressing their need for services and things such as education and healthcare, whereas the UNCCP would follow up on issues of repatriation and compensation. And the UNHCR was not to be mandated or to care for durable solutions for the refugees. And meanwhile, the UNCCP stopped to function in the late 50s, early 60s, and UNHCR has persisted with this interpretation that Palestinian refugees are outside of its mandate, and UNRWA has interpreted its protection mandate as being narrowly limited to reminding the world of the need for durable solutions, but it is not in a position, and understandably so really, to actually advocate, go to states and ask for Israel to repatriate refugees, or for hosting nations to integrate refugees, or for third country solutions. So you have what is a fundamental protection gap on the issue of durable solutions, and thus we have this enduring multi-generation situation of refugeehood and formal statelessness amongst the majority of Palestinians and in particular the refugee community. And by statelessness, I don't mean to imply a loss of, or a lack of nationhood, but formally Palestinians continue to live without citizenship that can be through which they can realize fundamental rights such as the right to work or self-determination. And so over the years, there's been also an additional layer to this protection gap, which is that many people defer to the political process as the location where Palestinian refugee rights will be dealt with. So frequently, if one were to raise the question of the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, it would be deferred to the bilateral political process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Well, we all know that that political process is not happening. And even when there was a political process, and even in those moments where there were bilateral talks ongoing, the refugees were not prioritized in terms of thinking in very practical ways about what would happen to them and how their rights would be realized. There was some discussions of symbolically recognizing the right of return or the existence of the refugees, or UN Resolution 194, which is a call for the repatriation of the refugees. But there's never been really any political effort or any UN effort to look at really how do you address the issue of enabling Palestinian refugees to realize their fundamental rights, from return to livelihoods, from jobs to civil rights, to the right to vote, etc. And inherent in all of those questions, of course, is the necessity of giving the refugees a choice in the process of their futures. And so we find ourselves in a long-standing protection gap, and it is not, and one that we need to constantly be reminded of, because as actors in the international regime, we have to look for ways to close this gap. We have to be reminded that we can advocate for the rights of the refugees without continuously being pushed into the non-existent political corner. We have to recognize the limitations of the great work of UNRWA, but also its limitations in being able to do the hard work of seeking durable solutions for the refugees. There may be some differences of opinion in how we come at this challenge of the protection gap, but I do think that at this moment where we face really huge new political challenges, from the change in the administration in the U.S., from the uprisings and the multi-layered refugee crises that are now presenting themselves in the region and to Europe and beyond, it is a very difficult time to say, well, we have to renew this effort to close the protection gap that exists around the refugees. It may not be a practical time, but ultimately there is an opportunity, because the world is going to have to face these overlapping refugee crises and the situation of mass displacement and migration in new and creative ways. And those efforts need to include the Palestinian refugees, and we have to look for solutions for them, and ways in which we can give them more voice in defining their future. So I will just put that out there for discussion, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Hilal, for your presentation and the focus on examining that gap between protection and what is afforded to Palestinian refugees and their rights, and finding a political solution. I wish to open the floor now to questions and comments for any of our panelists. Yes.
Hi, my name is Riham, and I'm myself Palestinian Syrian refugee. And you were mentioning that we have this lack of effort to find a solution to protect Palestinian refugees everywhere. Who is lacking this effort? Is it the Palestinian Authority? Is it the Palestinian refugees themselves? Is it the international community? Is it the UNRWA? Is it the United States? Who is responsible for Palestinian refugees to advocate for their rights, in your opinion?
Yeah, we'll take at least 2 or 3 questions, and then the panelists will address that. Any other questions right now? Okay, so Leila.
I mean, I think it's a very good question, and obviously one that could be answered in multiple ways. I think in terms of the displacement of the refugees and the issue of the right of return, which is the fundamental right at stake for Palestinian refugees, it is ultimately Israel's responsibility to allow refugees to return to their homes, essentially, or to return to country of origin. Of course, it's complicated because Palestinians were displaced from a territory that was to be the Palestinian state, and then became the Israeli state. But under international law, it's up to the refugees to decide whether to go back, and it's then up to Israel, as controlling the borders, to essentially let the refugees go in. Now, is that going to happen? No. So then we do look to Palestinians to organize, to mobilize, to ask for their rights, and we look to the Palestinian leadership to help achieve those rights. And it's also fundamentally and essentially also part of the international responsibility to enforce norms that are recognized as normal and taken for granted, essentially, for other refugees in the world to stand up and say that this is a fundamental right for Palestinian refugees as well. And if the political process is not going to be enabled, if there will not be a political process that will address Palestinian refugees, then we look to the UN to create that process. So that's a very rough answer to say that I suppose there's a role for everyone in this process.
Okay.
Does anybody else wish to weigh in on that? Okay. Yes, in the back, please. Your question? Oh, I didn't know who raised their hand in the back. Okay, yes, your question.
Hi, my name is Naya Park. I'm a representative of World Information Transfer. Social entrepreneurship is very critical and important nowadays. So because social entrepreneurs create these very interesting innovations and resources for numerous communities. And especially when social entrepreneurs collaborate with different organizations, I believe it really can progress different initiatives as well. So how do we collaborate more with these social entrepreneurs to improve communities such as the Palestinian refugees? And does UNRWA also have part with these social entrepreneurs and collaborate with them for future projects or different initiatives?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, maybe 2 reflections. One is that this is an increasing focus of some of UNRWA's work in terms of what comes beyond education. As I think I mentioned earlier, many refugees will tell us it's good to get the education, but what next? And clearly social entrepreneurship in that respect is an important aspect. In Lebanon, for example, we're collaborating with a few organizations and governments trying to set up social entrepreneurship hubs there. And sort of our voice is, as UNRWA is, don't forget the Palestinians in this. We're not sure we should set something up specifically for the Palestinians. Again, they should have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else and benefit from initiatives in this regard. The other aspect of this is that for a number of years we've had a microfinance program which is precisely aimed at those who can, that have a certain capacity and education and opportunities, get supported to make use of entrepreneurial opportunities. So there's not just the linking with partners looking into this, but also a distinct programmatic aspect from UNRWA.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to add? I would probably just add, really agreeing with everything you said, and would add the point that the Palestinian refugees have generally, in all kinds of situations, been quite leading in terms of social entrepreneurship. In Jordan, for instance, the private sector for a long time has been quite dominated by Palestinians, actually. And even at a more basic level, if you go into any camps, you'll see all kinds of low scale, or small scale, I should say, entrepreneurship in terms of people setting up informal businesses, or people doing maybe even unofficial types of apprenticeships or training in the camps. So what's really come across for me from this panel is the need to take a two-pronged approach in engaging directly with the refugees to make sure that they're given the training and the help and resources to maximize this potential, but also at the same time to not lose sight of the wider structural problems that need to be tackled so that this can really come into full fruition.
Thank you. Yes,
thank you. I'm from Namibia. I was just wondering, we were talking, I want to address my question to Leila and maybe anybody else who would like to comment on it. It occurs to me that, first of all, you have a lot of attempts, or there's a lot of publicity on refugees such as from Syria, even Eritrea, all over the place. Countries that saying, bring us your refugees, or we will try to find a space for your refugees. So why is it that there does not seem to be this support from states generally to take in, just as a question, to take in refugees, to say, okay, well, you can come and live in our country until the situation in your country improves. I've been privileged to meet descendants of refugees from other countries, who lived in the 50s and the 60s, even earlier than that, even in the 1920s or 30s. However, we are talking about lots and lots of refugees from Palestine who are now seem to be in limbo. Okay, and that's the first aspect of the question. The second aspect is, when you look at the history of Israel and current present-day Palestine, when we were at school, we all learnt about how we were told about these boats of Jewish people who had no homeland, and there was this whole effort to find them a homeland, and there were all these considerations of how it was done. And so the whole, I don't know if it's the propaganda or how to put it, but the history of this is always taught as if, then the world went and found them or allowed them to go back to this historical place which they called a homeland eventually. And now it's become so that they have built these walls, and they have thrown out the Palestinian people. Obviously I'm putting it in a very simplistic manner, right? But my point is just that if you have all these refugees who really need to have their homeland, why is it that they are being, what is it that is allowing these people to be pushed out little by little? If they were living in that part of the world, how on earth did we get to a point where there are these, the largest population of refugees, which is literally living on the edge of society and on the verge of falling off the edge of society with no real, don't know what to say, support, or I'm saying it in a very clumsy way because these are just thoughts that came to me when I was listening to this presentation, but literally people who are not as you say, there is not really an agency, even within the UN, that is dealing with their political situation. So, yeah, I just want to have some ideas, some thoughts on these questions that I have.
In regards to the first part of your question about why Palestinian refugees do not receive the same treatment, let's say, as other refugees coming from Syria, an example I can give you at the moment is that the UK government does not, in their resettlement plans for Syrian refugees, does not include Palestinian refugees, and I would argue it's because they do not have a citizenship from the state of Palestine. They are without this recognition of having protection that other refugees from other states do have. In regards to the other part of your question, one small point that I would sort of say to explain to you why Israel insists on not allowing the return of the refugees is the insisting on having a Jewish majority state, and therefore not allowing the refugees. It's a political goal, if you may, that they are not willing to, at the moment, compromise on. But international law does say that those refugees have legal rights to return or to ask for compensation.
Just to say, I think when the peace, when Arafat made his famous compromise to say that the Palestinians would accept a state on 22% of the territory of the West, so a state in West Bank and Gaza Strip. This was a historic compromise, and it kicked off a series of peace talks under different leaderships on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side up until the recent past, in which the primary assumption was that once a homeland or a state was created for Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, then the refugees that are living in those territories, but also in the neighboring countries and further afield, who need a state and citizenship, could go to that Palestinian state and live amongst Palestinians in the nation and state of Palestine. And so that's been the political paradigm that everyone has been operating against for almost 3 decades now. So, but the acceptability of that for the refugees themselves has always been a question, because the right of return is one that's grounded in the exercise of personal choice, and so allowed to be created, and the Palestinians don't have control over their borders, so they can't allow the refugees to come in. So we're stuck, essentially. I mean, everyone needs a state, and the Israelis who are settled in Israel now have certain levels of entitlements, but the test of coexistence will be one that will be with both the Israelis and Palestinians for years to come.
It's just a quick reflection that I think will mirror a lot of what's been said. The first one is on the when UNRWA turned 65, sadly, 2 years ago. So the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said at an event here that UNRWA was created as a result of a political failure. And if you want to fix UNRWA and the issues related to that in terms of responsibilities for refugees, you need to undo that political failure. You need to address that. And that's a consistent line we take. This is not a question of which agency in the system has what mandate. This is a question of what led to this in the first place, and that needs to be addressed. The second reflection is that I often heard in the field from refugees that UNRWA is like government for them. Not in a political sense, not elected, but in terms of service provision. Usually, governments finance their services through tax income from their citizens. Obviously, we cannot do that. So the contributions of the international community to UNRWA are in many ways in lieu of tax, which then leads to what's the responsibility of the taxpayers, as it were, which is the international community. So what I'm trying to reflect on is I don't want to, as a UN official, comment on the role of one specific state. We do believe that the international community, going back to what happened 67 years, has a fundamental responsibility to address this. Our governing board is the General Assembly, unlike HCR and other organizations and programs that have their own governance structure. Our governance structure is the Assembly. And since we are linked to the question of Palestine and Palestine refugees, it ultimately falls back to the Assembly, I think, to address this explicitly. And that's the international community of states, and in particular those who allowed to happen what happened.
Thank you for that. If I could just add to the question that and the contributions that were made, I think it goes back to addressing root causes in order to understand. So if we look back, as was noted, to the Nakba, to 1948, we are almost 70 years beyond that. Those who were expelled, who numbered less than 1 million people, now they and their descendants are 5.5 million people. It is the result of a protracted plight, but yet an expulsion of a people and the deliberate denial of their right to return immediately at the end of hostilities. We have to ask ourselves, in looking at the root causes, if an armistice agreement was signed in 1949, which it was, why were these people denied the right to return to their homes, to their land in 1949? So 1 year later, they were denied because the majority of them were deliberately expelled, and the return of these people was obstructed by then the State of Israel, precisely to the point that was raised by Pietro, which is to preserve the Jewish majority in what was then to be the State of Israel. But the desire of the State of Israel to create that type of homogeneity or majority in the state is not in conformity with international law as it pertains to human rights and as it pertains to refugees. So in addressing this, we always have to look at that root cause and going to what Mathias said, to the international responsibility flowing from the partition, the decision undertaken in the General Assembly 70 years ago in 1947 to partition what was then Mandate Palestine, and the consequences arising therefrom, which remain unresolved. And I think that also brings us to the reason that the question of Palestine remains on the UN agenda since its inception. Many times we are told, well, you know, there are so many other crises in the world, and why do you continue to, you know, push for international attention? Yes, we are asked this question, like, you need to be aware of everything else that is going on. We are aware of what is going on, but we also have a duty and a responsibility to advocate for the plight of our people, for solutions that are in conformity with international law, and certainly we invoke international responsibility in that context. So we can't just invoke international law without invoking international responsibility. And the concept that it is the Palestinians alone that have to find the solution is not something that we can accept upon ourselves. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Tarani. Ambassador Fedwa, thank you for reverting to the fundamental issue of excuse me, the fundamental issue of what is the Palestinian issue is all about. It is about the dispossession of the Palestinian people, and it is unfortunate that the international community is left holding the bag, having to finance the resolution or a remedy to this crisis that is protracted, persistent, and enduring. And I wanted to thank the gentleman from the UNRWA. I have to confess I am a product of the UNRWA education from the first grade to the 9th grade, so thank you very much. Just continue to do what you're doing. I think it is fundamental. At the same time, it is really essential to go back to the origin, the genesis of this crisis, and that is the persistence of the Israeli occupation and the disproportionate leverage that the State of Israel, as well as the United States, is playing on the international scene to prevent a resolution to this crisis. That's my comment. My question is, we're finding that since the inception of the Palestinian Authority, there has been a very sharp decline in the number of Palestinians who are pursuing their college education. Palestinians would, at the rate of probably 8 out of 10, would go to college after high school, probably 7 out of 10. I'm not sure about the statistic. But right now we're finding real studies in Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon. There's nothing now in Syria, unfortunately. The number is 2 out of 10. Sometimes 1 out of 10 are going to pursue their education, college education. It used to be that the PLO would have these scholarships at the former Soviet bloc, at different countries, Muslim countries, Pakistan, different places where Palestinians would go and pursue their education. This is not happening. Is there any resolution to this? Is the UNRWA looking at that? And the question to Ambassador Fida is the Palestinian Authority also looking at trying to mitigate that problem of lack of college education for Palestinian refugee kids?
Thank you for that. And did you have a question? And then we can take the floor to answer.
Okay, thank you. Well, my question is for Ms. Fida and also for Ms. Leila. Is the right to return is incompatible with the right to have a citizenship in a country? And if not, why we're not pushing Arab countries or neighboring countries, or not pushing, at least make an official statement that giving those people their rights and giving them citizenship is not incompatible with the right to return. If we make this statement, at least those people can make an agency to say, we need the exact rights. We were born in those countries. Our parents were born in those countries. Palestine, we want to go back to Palestine, but this doesn't mean that we are deprived from our rights. And I'm asking this question because the UNRWA cannot make such a political statement usually, but it's always insisting on the right to return. And the PLO and the Palestinian Authority are always insisting and emphasizing for Arab countries that we care about the right to return. That's why we don't want to resettle Palestinian refugees in the neighboring countries. When are we going to change this discourse?
Thank you. And a last question, Irfan.
Thank you very much to the permanent observer of Palestinian for convening this meeting, and for the Cuban mission. And I would like also to express our appreciation to the comprehensive presentation we have received. And we would like to make a comment and also a question. First of all, we are deeply concerned regarding the humanitarian situation, the dire humanitarian situation that Palestinians are suffering. We also consider that the root cause is the continued occupation made by the Israeli government, and also the colonialist policies and practice that this government has pursued during the last year. We would like to know which additional efforts can made by the suffering, and also in order to end the humanitarian situation of the refugees, and in particular what the civil society can do in addition. Right now we have the 2030 agenda, and also we have the declaration about the refugees and migrants. And we need ways to find ways in order to the international community, but also the civil society, face this situation and to pursue the main achievement of this goal. Also, we would like to know what additional efforts we can make in order to face the situation of the illegal exploitation of national resources, because this issue is very important. This is completely illegal. This is a colonialist way to exploit people, and we consider that we need to see and focus this area in order to complete the achievement of the 2030 agenda and the migrants and refugees declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so who would like to go first to address comments and intervention? Yes, go ahead.
Part of your question is what was, if I heard it correctly, what are the opportunities for education beyond grade 9, university education, etc., and what's UNRWA doing about this? If I illustrate that a bit on the case of Lebanon, which I'm sure you know, we have between 500 to 1,000 young people reaching the market, the labor market, each year. UNRWA has 3,000 permanent staff. So clearly UNRWA cannot absorb these young people looking for an opportunity in life. The Lebanese government, as was mentioned by someone on the panel here, has put legally off-limits 36 professions for Palestine refugees. And they include the kinds of professions that make a modern society tick: doctors, architects, engineers, etc. So the question I often get also, or got from Palestine refugee young people, was, what's the point of getting, an education, including a university education, if I can then not legally practice that profession? The only chance I really have is to go abroad, and then people are telling me right of return means you should go, from the perspective of Lebanon, 150 kilometers south of here. Now, we are trying with UNRWA and other partners to mobilize resources as much as we can for scholarships. But I sincerely, the point I'm trying to make is it's not about that. It's even if we found we currently are able to give 120, 130 scholarships together as a community to young Palestine people. Again, 500 to 1,000 are looking for. So there are real limits to this. I really think it's a huge stretch and won't happen to mobilize the kinds of resources that are needed to put young Palestinians into university education. So we're back at the point that we discussed just now. Why are there limited opportunities? At the end of the day, this is fundamentally political. And one final comment, if I may. What we perceive increasingly is a push by the international community to say the host governments need to absorb this. Now, from a dignity and human rights perspective, I also think, and a security perspective, the government of Lebanon, for example, could do more in this respect. But what we need to be careful of is that we, in that process, don't lose sight of the question of Palestine. Because, I can understand the Lebanese, I don't know if anyone from Lebanon is here, who would say every third or fourth person in our country is currently a refugee. We have 1 million poor Lebanese looking for work. And you, as an international community, are asking us to prioritize the refugees in terms of employment and higher education opportunities. I think it's only fair that we respect the Lebanese government saying, there are limits here. And by pushing this to us, you are in a sense transferring also the political question away from where it should be, which is back to the international community and its responsibility. So I'm sorry if I can't answer the question more specifically in terms of, there are opportunities, more can be done for scholarships and higher education opportunities, but I sincerely believe that will not solve the fundamental problem of dignified living for young Palestinians.
Thank you, Mathias. Just quickly on that point, your question also asked about what the Palestinian government is doing in terms of trying to mitigate that problem and in seeking to provide opportunities for higher education. Bilaterally, in terms of relations with other states and countries, it is always one of our appeals for those countries that can to provide scholarships or training opportunities to Palestinian high school graduates, multilaterally as well in the international realm, in trying through the UN and organizations to secure training opportunities and scholarship opportunities for Palestinians. And then to the question regarding whether the right to return is incompatible with the right to citizenship. If anybody else wants to weigh in, but just very quickly because we're out of time and we would have to vacate the room. And before I get to that, just to the question by Cuba as to what can be done. Part of promoting Agenda 2030 for development is providing support to Palestine in the sense that it is concrete support, such as scholarships and education and training opportunities, partnerships and other kinds of cooperation that can address the real life needs of the various segments of our population, whether it is under occupation or the refugee community throughout the region, and concentrating support both in terms of humanitarian and socioeconomic support, but making sure that it is consistent and in conformity with the principles and solidarity that various countries have firmly stood by in their positions regarding Palestine. And to the question of the right to return and is it compatible with the right to citizenship, I think that we do have a problem in the perception of it as being mutually exclusive, that preserving the right to return, as Leila said, as a right enshrined in international law and a right to which each individual refugee, so it's an individual and collective right, that preservation of that should not be seen as being mutually exclusive with the right to live a dignified life, the right to be a citizen, the right to seek gainful employment, the right to seek education, the right to live in dignity with your fundamental human rights in the absence of a just political solution. So exercising your human rights should not be seen as negating your right to return. And I think that in that gap between the reality and the absence of a political process, unfortunately, that right to return is holding people in this sort of limbo where they're not being granted their human rights, whether it be human rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or their civil, political, cultural, and other rights. And I think it's a serious dilemma. But as you know, there are states that have granted rights to the Palestinian refugees in the form of citizenship, such as Jordan, and that is also the sovereign right of a state. But I would personally say that it should not be seen as mutually exclusive, that while a just and lasting political solution is not found, that a people should be denied the exercise of and respect of their fundamental human dignity and rights. Leila, I don't know if you wanted to add to that before we are asked to leave.
That's a great answer. That's so no, nothing to add.
Okay. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for their very in-depth and enriching presentations. Thank you to everyone who has attended for your participation and also for your support and solidarity. Thank you.